Next up is Mary F. Calvert. She's a photojournalist who spent a great deal of her career bringing awareness to underreported stories about women and children around the world. The mothers and daughters and sisters and wives who every day are struggling and striving for the most basic of human rights. When she began to learn about the issue of sexual assault in the U.S. military, a staggering 26,000 incidents of rape and assault in 2012 alone, she did what the best of photojournalists do and raised her camera to combat the issue. Please welcome Mary Calvert.
Hello, everybody. Good morning. I'm so honored to be on this stage showing my work and being with all of you. For nearly a decade, I've been building a body of work documenting the struggle of women in the developing world to secure for themselves and their families the most basic of human rights, an environment of corruption, poverty, disease, armed conflict, and rape. I don't consider these women's issues, I consider these our issues, and I firmly believe that the marginalization of half the world's population is the greatest ethical, economic, and societal challenge of our time. I became a photojournalist so I could tell the stories of those with little voice. And I think as journalists, we have a duty to shine a light into the deepest recesses of the human experience and provide a mirror for society to examine itself. And basically, it's my job to show the human toll behind the statistics and to make you care. The project that I'm going to show you on military sexual trauma really began because I lost my job. Back in New Year's Eve of 2009, every single photographer at the Washington Times was laid off. And I had actually traveled the world for the Washington Times doing these projects, and I think as photojournalists in the United States, sometimes we have this almost provincial view that we're going to go out into the world and show the world's ills. And because I no longer had the money to do this kind of travel and a newspaper behind me and somebody to actually publish the work, I was forced to look in my own backyard. And my husband, Joe Edens, who is an amazing photographer, said, you know, you should be looking at military sexual trauma because it's a terrible problem and nobody's doing anything about it. And for the last 20 years, I've been on the faculty of the Department of Defense Worldwide Military Photographers Workshop. And for years, I've walked the halls of these different bases, and I've seen bulletin boards offering assistance to people who have been sexually assaulted in the military, and 24-hour hotlines to offer assistance. And I really used to look at those and think, surely that's not happening in the military, in our military. And then I started to do the research and discovered that in the previous year, there was an estimated 26,000 sexual assaults in the US military. 1 in 5 of those people actually report the assault, and then 1 in 10 of those actually ever see any justice or even a trial. And a lot of those women and men end up leaving the military while their perpetrator is enjoying their career. So I thought, how on earth do I start this project? It seemed like this huge thing. And so I began to go to hearings on Capitol Hill. I live in the Washington area, so I'm fully credentialed for that, and so it was easy to go. And that's where I started to meet people. And I went to hearings on the House side and the Senate side, and it would introduce myself. This is Jessica Hinvez, and she was a F-16 fighter jet mechanic. And she had a very bright career ahead of her. And one night, after everybody was out drinking, a member of her squadron raped her. And she wasn't going to say anything, but people heard the struggle and reported it for her. And she went through this really difficult investigation where she felt like she was being investigated. And then the night before it was going to go to trial, there was a new commander. And he looked at all the transcripts and evidence and what little there was, and said, well, while he did not act as a gentleman, there's no reason to prosecute. And it was just tossed out. And then soon after that, she was tossed out. And so so I kept going to these hearings and would always introduce myself, pass out cards. I was there when the top prosecutors and lawyers from the military justice system would come and were grilled by senators and congressmen. And one day I went to the House side, and this young woman, Jennifer Norris, was speaking, and she was talking about how her recruiter, she had just joined the Air Force, and her recruiter invited her to a recruits-only party. And when she arrived, she was the only one there, and he drugged her and raped her. And so here she is on Capitol Hill telling the details of this devastating thing that happened to her, and this is who was in the audience. This is who she was talking to. And I have been in this particular exact hearing room many, many times, and I must tell you that when the baseball players came to Capitol Hill to discuss steroid use, this room was standing room only. There were probably 20 or 30 photographers down that well. But when the military sexual trauma survivors came, you could see how much interest there was. And when I saw this, I really got pissed off, and that's what really drove me to tell this story. And when I started, I had nobody interested in the project, and I didn't really have anybody that would publish it, and I just kept going, and I would say to myself, I'm going to go within a day's drive of my house. And so once I photographed one woman, she would recommend me to somebody else, and that's how I started meeting other people who were willing to tell their stories. This is Natasha, and she was in the Army, and this was in Fort Bragg, and she was the only person I actually photographed in uniform. Now, this is Dr. Nancy Lutwak. She's the physician at the ER at the VA in New York City, and she started to screen people, asking women that came in, if they had been sexually assaulted. And she looked around this ER and she thought, this is not a safe place for anybody to reveal anything. And so she cleared out this storeroom and opened up the women's treatment room, just so people would feel safe. The symptoms of military sexual trauma include depression, substance abuse, paranoia, and feelings of isolation. And this is a woman down in San Diego. I must say, I worked on this project for a few months, and then I started to apply for grants. I was lucky, my dedication paid off, and I was awarded the Canon Female Photojournalist Award, so that offered me some funds to actually branch out and visit other parts of the country. This is a woman who was raped several times. She went to sleep after a Christmas party and woke up with a fellow soldier with his hands around her throat saying, while he was raping her, saying, "Go ahead and scream, there's nobody in the building to hear you." And so she lives with the trauma of what happened to her, and victims usually end up drowning, spending years drowning in shame and fear as the psychological damage silently eats away at their lives. And she had a terrible drug problem. Her child was sort of living on the fringes while she would retreat into her thoughts, trying to live with this trauma and rebuild her life. Kate Weber was in the Army, and 1 week into a deployment to Germany, she was sexually assaulted, and she told me that she knew this person was a repeat offender the second he touched her. And she spent years just basically waking up and staying in bed all day while her son would be running around, and you could tell that she told me that he had secondary PTSD because of what had happened to her. And she has since really come a long way with her life. This woman was a victim of the scandal at Lackland Air Force Base, where recruiters were going after the female recruits. And Natasha, that's the woman in the uniform, and she has isolated herself so much that she's become some kind of a sort of a survivalist, and she was building this greenhouse, this survivalist greenhouse in her backyard. And San Diego, the women there had this action where they wrote their rape story on these shower curtain liners and then hung them up on a footbridge right across from Naval Station San Diego. And they were only up for about, I think, a day before they were taken down. And Jen Norris again, she was the one who was testifying, and Jen was basically unable to leave her home, and then she went through training to get a service dog, and this is her service dog, Onyx, who is lovely. And it was interesting because the gals in San Diego had these giant sort of Doberman pinchers with giant teeth that looked like they could rip your throat out. And meanwhile, the people on the East Coast seem to have these Labradors. Yeah, so this is Jen and Jessica. Jessica's the one who was in the first picture, and I was in Biloxi, Mississippi, where Jesse's husband was stationed. And late at night, the two of them just start talking, and it always comes back to what happened and the injustices that befell them. And these are Coast Guard women. My coasties, they're lovely. I'm going to move along here because I've got a whole other section. And this is Natasha again. Basically, her whole military career was just stuffed into the corner next to that bookcase next to her bed, where she has a weapon, a couple of clips, a couple of knives, a surveillance house security system right next to her, and all her cocktail of drugs, they're all on these cocktails of drugs. And she was also going through counseling, but she went to the Quakers because she couldn't get an appointment on base to help her with her trauma. And one of the other symptoms of military sexual trauma are suicide. And that's sort of the final devastating decision some of these women make. This I'll go to her father. This is Gary Nolan, and his daughter had come home from the military. He thought she was coming home on leave, but as it turns out, she had been kicked out with a bad conduct discharge, and 5 days later, she committed suicide. And when her belongings returned, he found her journals and discovered that she had been raped. So this is a broken man who is every day trying to rebuild his life. So I kept going with this, and 2 years before, I had been a finalist for the Alexia Foundation Women's Initiative grant. And so when they offered it again, I decided to apply, and then I thought, I can't put the same proposal in. So that forced me to really, really go even deeper in the project. And that's when I discovered that homeless women are the fastest growing group of homeless people. Homeless veterans are the fastest growing group of homeless people in the United States, 4 times more likely than civilian women to be homeless. And a lot of these women have survived military sexual assault, and a lot of them have been released from the military with less than honorable discharges. One of those is a bad conduct discharge. I think the most severe form of the retaliation that these women face is the personality disorder discharge. Basically, the military is saying, well, you're not acting this way because you're severely traumatized and everybody is harassing you and retaliating against you and calling you a liar. You're acting this way because you have a pre-existing condition called a personality disorder. And when they get that, they lose everything. I mean, they lose all their benefits. Every time they apply for a job, they have to show their DD-214, their discharge papers, which says personality disorder discharge, when they apply to colleges, and it even literally follows them to the grave because they can't be buried in a military cemetery. And so we have to think about the reasons people join the military. This woman, Darlene Matthews, joined because she was trying to escape an abusive household, and she went into the Army, and all she found was more abuse and more sexual assault. And she's been living in her car for 3 years now, and all the time trying to fight the VA for benefits, for a housing voucher for safe housing. Her life is kind of spread out all over the place. She's got belongings in a locker in the back of her car, and she's sick, and she sleeps in her car in the parking lot of a mortuary next to a graveyard. The cops basically leave her alone. And so when I started this project, I realized that homeless women veterans don't really look like what you would think homeless person would look like. It's a far more hidden population. And one of the first things I really learned was that access was going to be my biggest hurdle. I went to all these large organizations trying to find somebody to talk to, introduce me to your clients, and time after time after time, they wouldn't answer my emails, my phone calls. If they did, they told me that, well, we can't give you access to our clients. And that's when I started learning difficult truths about these large organizations who make millions of dollars a year, and money is sort of their prime motivator in figuring out who they're going to help. And so then I started going to these smaller organizations like the National Veterans Foundation. And then I reached out to a friend of mine who many of us know, and David Gilkey, formerly of NPR. He was just killed last week in Afghanistan. But, you know, we have this amazing community of photographers, and we reach out to each other for help, and it's really a family. And David had done this story on homeless women, veterans, and he told me that I should start going to these veteran stand-downs. And stand-down is a term from the Vietnam era where soldiers would come in from the field and replenish with a hot meal, some medical care, a safe place to sleep. And so certain organizations have these events for veterans, and that's where I started meeting even more people. And this woman was never actually raped, but she was in the Army, and every night while they're all trying to go to sleep, one of the officers would come in the room, a couple of them sometimes, and take one of the women to the bathroom, and they could hear the woman struggling, and they could hear the sexual assault going on. And she used to lay in her bed every night thinking, when are they going to come for me? And she said, I had to go to the bathroom so bad, but I would just, go to the bathroom next to my bed to avoid going in. So she's got the classic symptoms of military sexual trauma. She's drug abuse, self-medication, and she came to the stand-down to seek some aid. And so the stand-downs really turned out to be a great way to meet people.